Okay. First of all, hello Madrid, and thanks for your attention and coming. It's a privilege for my first presentation on the Meet-Magento events. So, a few words about me. I'm Filip Svetličić. I'm Magento certified front-end developer working at Inchu. Now we are full e-commerce agency from Osijek, Croatia. We are fast-growing company with over 40 employees, and we are Magento Silver solution partner. When it comes to me, I'm working with Magento for about 6 years now, and I have experience working with all kinds of projects, spanning from small to enterprise ones. And what is today, my topic would be to talk with you, of course, about how Magento 2 changed the way we are currently using JavaScript on the platform. So, Magento 2 release is just around the corner, and there are big changes present, and especially when it comes to JavaScript workflow. So, let's start with that. I would like to start first with current platform disadvantages. So, first of all, how many of us is front-end developers here, not the programmers? Cool. The second thing, but that's a joke. What will you expect from a web page that has about 100 JavaScript calls on the page, on the home page? Okay, now, I won't go into much details about current platform because as we clearly see, there is a lot of us doing that, but I need to mention a few very big performance issues that current platform got, okay? Now, the first is that prototype library is heavily integrated. Do you agree? Yeah, because why? Because in its core, it extends the DOM native objects, and when doing this, there is a significant performance issue with that. Okay, I won't go into anymore. It's enough. Now, there is also significant amount of inline JavaScript in PHTML files, and lastly, JavaScript calls are placed in the document head. Now, what's that? This can mean a few things. The first is that developers don't know how to do their job, because Magento has its own merging system and stuff. But that's not the only issue here. The real issue is that JavaScript is placed in the document head, and that is not a good practice. So we can merge the system, but still we are blocking the page rendering, and the thing is that this will not be as optimized as we need it to be. So this is very, very performance related issue. Now, by default, the JavaScript files together with CSS are the render blockers. So, why? Because before the browser can render a page, it has to build the DOM tree and by parsing the HTML markup. And when it encounters a script, it has to stop and execute it before it continues with the parsing. And in case of external script, it's forced to wait for resource to download, which will require one or more network round trips to actually render the page. Now, this can be translated to page load delay, and this is where it comes that is important, that we need to consider that. Page loading time is extremely beneficial to shoppers, and especially on mobile devices. So the recent researchers are clearly revealed that to us. Now, according to KISS metrics, for example, 47% of customers expect a web page to load in 2 seconds or less. 40% abandon a website that takes more than 3 seconds to load. And 79% of shoppers who are dissatisfied with website performance are less likely to buy from the same site again. Now, what is the answer on the upcoming version? Magento 2, well, it's that Magento 2 says hello to AMD. Now, how many of you are really working with AMD? Cool. I didn't work until the point of Magento 2, so what is AMD? Well, it's an asynchronous module definition, and it's a JavaScript specification that defines an API for defining call modules and their dependencies. So it's important to realize that now any JavaScript file is now, as we can call it now, a JavaScript module. And the system is loading them asynchronously if desired. Now Magento 2 decided to go with require.js, and here at Inchu we are strictly bound, as I don't know, maybe vast majority of you is bound to Magento 1 since the very beginning, and we don't work on other platforms. So we didn't have chance to work with newer technologies like AMD until the point of Magento 2 beta was first released. Now, when I first opened Magento 2 and started to trace the JavaScript, I was quite confusing and not being familiar with the concept. So it took me some time to actually get a grip to follow that. But let's see what we need to understand prior to working to Magento 2, because when you get to Magento 2, then you need to know something before. So something before are the basics of require.js. So let's see what will that bring to us. Now, why require.js? Easily managing dependencies of JavaScript resources. That means that if you are having a jQuery or, I don't know, jQuery UI, then an accordion widget, we will say, okay, don't load accordion widget before you load jQuery. We have those options. Now, the second is improved page loading time. That's because we are loading the modules asynchronously. And now, when we pass this, it's important to realize some of the basic require.js procedures. Now, the first is the actual initialization. We can see that this is a call for a script in the head, but it's the only one. And this code says, okay, load require.js from specific file hierarchy, and data main attribute is here the most important thing, because it says, okay, load me main.js file, or however you call it, and start configuring things inside that file. Now, wherever this file is present, this will be root for any other dependency modules, root URL path for all other JavaScript modules that we are adding later on or asynchronously or stuff. This is very important to understand. Now, second stuff, configuration options. So we basically, when using require, we can also pass a configuration object as our first option, where we can, for example, change the base URL path or add different paths for specific modules. Now, as we can clearly see, if we want that required module has a different path from the rest of the files, we can clearly say, okay, change the path for this module, and load it from there. Now, one especially important feature is mapping, and it's especially used for larger projects like Magento system is. Magento 2 is heavily using mapping, so it's really important to get a grip how to use it. Now, on the basic example, this says here, okay, basically substitute the module give an ID with another path. Okay. Now this is extremely beneficial for architecture when the amount of fallback is in the options. Okay, I will get to that later. Now, loading dependencies. This is where it begins. Now, it's very important to understand that in require.js there are two basic things you need to require for a module, and you need to define a module. Require is, for example, in our example, is in main.js, where all the configuration gets. Now, when we say require, we are require method actually. First parameter is accepts an array of module names. Module names means that where the path for the file is. So when this says in chew module, it will look in the base folder where the main JS script is placed, and it will load in chew module.js JavaScript, but we don't need to add extension. Now, when we actually said, okay, we need this dependency, now whatever in chew module.js file that we need to create afterwards is returns, it will be referenced through the function callback. And in this case, in chew module, or however you prefer to name your callback variable, okay? We can see the anonymous function with in chew model variable. Now, okay, now we are requiring for a dependency, and now we need to define the, so when it says defining a module, it actually says, okay, create my JavaScript file and actually return something. So define function. The most basic example of require.js configuration is to define a module as a function. To define module, we need to create custom file, and actually file tells require.js to define our own JS file and returns the initialize method in the configuration. Now, these are the basics, and now let's see how the require.js is actually integrated and implemented in Magento 2. Now, first, to get familiar with the concept, it's required to understand that first, the scripts are not initialized through the XML layout, no more. You can initialize, but it's not preferred, or however they say, it's not the real way to do it. Then the second, there is a module dependency hierarchy highly involved here, and most of the files are loaded asynchronously. Now, how to configure? Magento, through default page blocks, its XML file is actually loading the script require.js into the system. Now, we need to actually define our module, but this time in Magento. Now, to where the modules are usually defined in Magento 2, they are defined on library level. So, one of you know, you already know for variant, for JS folder and all the variant prototype widgets, or how do we call them, okay? But now, this is exactly the library level where all the jQuery and Mage widgets, JavaScript components are placed. This is the base level. Now, module level for all libraries in a module, for example, in some custom module, there is also where the modules can be defined in the JS folder, in the web folder JS, and in the theme level, of course. Now, to define the module, for example, if you need to define something, for example, in our custom theme inside JS in chew custom, okay, I name it like that. The file will be called in chew custom. We need to define our module. And we defining it. Okay, in this example, I used jQuery as a dependency and alert something just for the sake of this presentation. This is the most primitive level to actually define our model. Now, we need to initialize it so Magento can recognize this, and there are two ways to do it. First is using data mage initialize attribute. This is beneficial in cases where you want to load your JS file only when some interaction is achieved through if the element needs to be binded to something, for example, on the toggle or some other things like we do it. Now, this is the approach to do it in these circumstances. But there is also another approach, and this is to use the text x-magento-initialize script tag inside the PHTML files. Now, to initialize it, this is an example. If you need to initialize a module is a JavaScript file now, in required PHTML file. Now, I use some dummy example where on one, I don't know, anchor, I just used data mage initialize attribute and point and execute the following path to the file. Okay, so there is Magento catalog, JS, into custom, and when I used the parameters blank, it will still load the script. That there is the catch, it will load the script, but it's not the preferred way. If you just want to load the script, you will not use this, because this function receives JSON objects or a function as a return, and specific action needs to be triggered. So this is why I use this example, because this is not right way to do it. If you want to call to load without any interaction, you need to load it using Magento X attribute script tag. Now, this is example if you want to initialize a module without an interaction or a binding to some specific action related to that element. Now, let's revert back to a model mapping, because benefits of the mapping is that system can have several versions of specific resource which can be mapped to be loaded from different paths and on different occasions. Now, require config.js is placed all around in Magento, and it's required to actually create the mapping. And all configurations will be merged and executed, but not override. The file will be at the end when Magento outputs the final output. All files will be merged and sent as a final output. So, in the following order. First, it's the module level, team module level, for the parent team, for the current team level, and current team is the final thing. It will be placed last in the document. Now, to replace and customize default JS models. Now, if we, for example, in situations that we find ourselves in position to replace or customize the default JS components, this is where the mapping really kicks in. This is the stuff how they are imagine it to work. So, okay, this is example. We are replacing the Magento default menu. For example, all the main menu for mobile and for desktops. Now, this is how we actually do it. We said, okay, under my team, under my level, I don't need anymore the menu. Their default menu. I want my menu, and I just adding the pad there. Now, this is how this should work, and I tested it, and it works, and it's a good approach. Now, when we will replace it, of course, we need to define it. And now, for this example, I used jQuery UI, and mage-init as a dependency, because I want just to extend some kind of function. I don't want to override. I want to add. I want to change a method inside. So I use this 3 level of dependency, and afterwards my code works under these specific dependencies. Now, for last example, I used the Customizing Magento widget instance. You remember all when we worked on Magento 1, we had, I don't know, on the checkout, one-page checkout, we had accordions in 2 accordions, where, Magento accordions from the variant.js files, and we had the ability to extend some methods or how the workflow. Now, it's exactly the same thing, but it's changed because system is now using jQuery widgets, jQuery widget factory, and UI for these kind of tasks. Now, to demonstrate, now we are customizing Magento widget instance, but following our last example, where this is our custom module, and you see the dependencies, and we are just, this code says that we are just creating another widget. We are extending and adding our toggle function to it. Yeah? Now, when we saw some, this is about how the require and Magento JavaScript workflow is doing now. There is also one thing, UI components and knockout.js, but I still didn't be positioned to trace it. Well, it's kind of trickier for front-end developer to actually get familiar with that. But there will be no actual conclusion if we can't create comparison tests or something that will show us what is actually going on here, okay? Now, we saw how the system is supposed to function, but to get a full picture, it's always necessary to test it and compare it with the current platform, okay? So I have created a couple of performance tests so we can be sure, okay, if something is right or wrong. Now, the results. Magento 2 loads the DOM visually faster. That's the trick, because it's loading the files asynchronously, and they are not they are not rendering a problem anymore. But the whole system is now using more resources than before. Well, that's something that is a bad thing. Now, if we example this really good, you could see that the first version has, I am comparing just default themes, okay, Luma and Medicine Island. So 27 to 90, DOM loaded, you can clearly see, but document complete is still larger on the new version, and we are talking the document complete, but here we can clearly see that I just turn around this JS file size, so this size of 1.6 is for the Magento 2, sorry for that. Now, that's the problem. And how to remove that unnecessary scripts, because we have plenty of that. 90 calls is very much, and there is no official way still, because Magento merged all require config.js files. It's just merge them, it's just don't override them. But it's still in development, so I don't know for sure. But how we are seeing this problem in our way is actually send empty return to define method and send it blank. And because I don't want to have jQuery migrate on a home page of my custom project. I don't want to have mobile custom responsive. This is all things that I want to do on my own, because I don't need that. So we are just looping it through and set for now to the empty. And this is how this is supposed to work. Now, is the workflow really improved. When it comes to JavaScript workflow, Magento 2 is definitely introduced quite significant improvement with introducing us to AMD model loader with newer concepts and technologies in general. But what at Inchu we are concerned about the performance problems are still present, especially in loading significant amount of unnecessary JavaScript without reasonable way of removing them on project demand or something. They are just too dependent on the system as we can see it now. So thank you, and